What happened from 1998 when America described herself as 70% of America anyway, as intensely or extremely patriotic, to 39% today? I'm super interested to get your thoughts on that, but I also want to try and understand the duality, as you put it, between loving this country unabashedly and unapologetically, but also being able to criticize it with the same level of passion that you do in the war on warriors. That, my friend, is a neat trick.
I mean, it is my love for the military, my love for my time in uniform that brings me to this place where I have to be intensely critical of the institution that I love. But I come only from a place of reverence and appreciation of that.
This book is scary, honestly. At its heart, you're basically saying that the erosion of a meritocracy has infected the armed forces to the same kind of degree it's infected higher education. When I think, for instance, that the average graduate from Harvard finished with a GPA of 2.56 back in 1955, as opposed to 3.99 today, right? You, I mean,
Well, the kids are just so much smarter today, Mike.
Yes,
you have to
obviously.
understand.
So if the kids are not exponentially smarter, then our standards have exponentially changed. And it felt to me, reading your book, that that's the heart of your critique. The meritocracy that defined the military has abdicated.
that is the heart of the critique. It is, if there's one institution that we as citizens ought demand be completely based, other than the airline industry with pilots, be completely based in or any number of highly specialized skills, be completely based on merit. It's the United States military, and for our sons and daughters joining, we ought to have full confidence that the institution they're joining, which could send them to war and ask them to die, is doing so in a manner that fully protects that life and gives them every advantage to win no matter what. And that was the ethos, for the most part, of the military that I joined. It wasn't perfect. I also joined a lot of mixed, multi-ethnic units because I was in the New Jersey Guard and different units. And racial animus was not an issue. It was not. I mean, would guys razz? Sure, like anything. But this was a team devoted to a mission, that loved the country and wanted to serve. And our best performers were elevated into leadership positions, and our poorer performers were relegated or pushed out altogether. And that's what it's supposed to look like in a fighting force. And just over time, you started to see political prerogatives being pushed from the top, that weren't focused on standards or accountability or meritocracy or lethality, but on sort of social just, politically correct priorities that wanted to make the military look a lot more like civilian society. And there was, as the book lays out, Mike, there was a role the military has played in, say, racial integration, and it did it better than anybody else, earlier than anybody else. And once black men were serving alongside white men, those white men realized there was no basis for their racism because they were equals with the black men they were serving with across the board. And so it served that healthy function. But really, in this story, it started with women in combat. I mean, it started before that, but more or less, it was this idea that politicians and political ideologues at the end of the Obama administration wanted to solidify women in all combat roles. And that's when, with very little fight in the Army and the Air Force, with some fight in the Marine Corps, and I have immense respect for the Marine Corps, there was pushback to say, well, let's test this and see if women joining combat units make them more effective. And of course, the study showed, I mean, bone density and lung capacity and muscle difference, it's all that the all male units performed much, much better.
Talk about
But
that study, Pete, because it was extensive and it was incontrovertible, and yet somehow or another, it was roundly ignored.
it was mandated. It was extensive. It was incontrovertible. The evidence was overwhelming. The amount of injuries that females had, and this was a unit of 400 men doing extensive field exercises versus a unit of 300 men and 100 women integrated in those field exercises. And women were injured at much higher rates. Their ability to maneuver on the battlefield was much lower than men. That unit was much less ready and capable. And yet, even when those results were presented, the Marine Corps, the Secretary of the Navy, Ray Mabus, and others did everything they could to contort the language to make it sound like there really wasn't that much of a difference. They went so far as saying maybe these 100 Marines aren't representative of all women. So this sort of dismissing the whole idea that you could have a sample size, or a control group.
Right.
So it's just, and ultimately Obama wanted women in all units, and they wanted to be able to put that statement out, and they did. And what hasn't happened, first of all, what hasn't happened is men and women haven't changed, right? So we're the same. But what has happened is, instead of keeping standards high and allowing women to compete for them, standards have been forced down formally or informally by commanders and admirals and others who are under political pressure to say, well, why don't you have 15% of women in this military MOS or this military job? And that question is not a question, it's a suggestion, which leads to, they don't say the standards are changing, they say the standards are evolving. Which of course means they're just lowering.
Wait. When your commanding officer asks a question or makes a suggestion, that's just fancy talk for an order, right?
Correct. So the whole thing, nothing's written down, nothing's told, but the whole thing is, well, I think, are we doing enough to make sure that we have enough women in the Ranger battalions? Just think about that. That's a signal. That's an order. Things change. And we didn't even include all the stories on there. The reason I knew this book would get a big response from vets and those serving is because I spent a whole 6 months talking to dozens and dozens and dozens of them across all the service, actively serving, anonymously, willing to talk to me. Just one guy put me in touch with another all over the different units, different ranks, and they all sang the same tune. They said commanders are walking on eggshells because standards are lowering. There are new classes of who's in and who's out, who's up and who's down, what the Army wants, what the Army doesn't want. And then, of course, you had the COVID vaccine mandates, and then you had what happened on January or in the summer of 2020, and then on January 6th, and then you had the political view. That my own story comes in there, but it all sort of mushes together to create an unhealthy environment, which is distracted from its core purpose, which used to be, we find the best dudes, put them together, go kill bad guys. And now it's all these other boxes we need to check, which creates animosity or skepticism or reticence, or, hey, was that person promoted for the right reasons or not the right reasons, which means that person is impugned either way. And it's maybe fair to them or unfair to them. All things you can tolerate in a Harvard faculty lounge, not things you can tolerate in the 101st Airborne when their job is to get dropped behind enemy lines.
And yet, you're saying that that's precisely what's happened.
I know for a fact that's what's happening. Absolutely. It's what's happened and is what is actively ongoing and happening.
The difference, of course, being if things get completely bananas at Harvard, and it would have to get even worse than it is now. If people truly look at Harvard and see the $52 billion endowment, see the plagiarism, see the real attitude and philosophy among the faculty, see the credentialed inflation, if they add all that up together, right? I mean, eventually the donations will stop and companies will stop hiring Harvard grads, and that degree will lose its prestige and become little more than a receipt. And parents will eventually get the memo, and the ship will have to turn around. And that's a hell of a consequence for the leading educational institution on the planet. But the stakes are so different here. They're so different. And in a top-down organization like the military, I mean, how do you turn this ship around? What needs to happen to get the rot out?
That's a big benefit, Mike, is that it is a top-down run organization. There's only one Pentagon. There's only one Secretary of Defense. At the top, it starts with, you need a new commander-in-chief. You need a new commander-in-chief who won't tolerate woke nonsense in the military, who will hire a Secretary of Defense, who will pursue the basics of what the military is supposed to do. You hire a chairman of the Joint Chiefs and other chairmen, who none of which have been invested in this sort of, whether it's the gender stuff or the DEI CRT stuff or the environmental green tanks nonsense, any
The
of that,
electric tanks I
the
read about.
electric tanks that, it's, by the way, I have a friend who's making an electric vehicle for the military, but he's doing it on the side because the military won't contract with them because the military only wants 100% electric. And his thing is, well, I want to give him a hybrid that can go diesel for 95% of the time, but then for special operators can go electric when you're within 500 feet of your objective and you want to be silent. That sounds good to me. Like, that's a good
because
application of
there's a
technology.
tactical advantage and not a
Yes,
virtuous
exactly.
advantage.
But so you find all the people that were most invested and you fire them. You say, you're done. You say, if you want to do this, you're out. You push them out, you age, whatever it is. And you reorient the priorities in a top-down organization. You say, we're getting rid of DEI, getting rid of CRT. We're going back to the standards, whatever they were in 1998 for the infantry and across other combat arms roles. And we're going to hire the guys that made Maverick, and they're going to do our ads for us. And then at the end of this book, I wrote a letter to my sons, which is how I wanted to close it. And I'll tell you, Mike, I waited until the book was written to write that. So I didn't write that until the end because I really didn't know. There were some parts in the intro where I alluded to it, but I didn't know what I was going to say, whether I would actually recommend that my kids go into the business of the profession of arms. And ultimately, I came out with the conclusion that I would like them to serve, because if you want to rebuild this military, you need patriots coming from the bottom up too. And if not the Hegseth boys, then who's it going to be?
You're basically writing a letter to your boys 10, 15 years down the road.
Correct.
Right? If my boys are going to raise their right hand and put the American flag on their shoulders, I want them where it matters, where real decisions are made, and where meritocracy, for the most part, still reigns. Service to country, with God in your hearts, will take you places and teach you things you will never learn anywhere else. You will be forged, you will be warriors, and you will never regret it. You will join another brotherhood, an elite brotherhood. This is all following up your advice to join the SEALs, the Rangers, the Green Berets, the Marine Raiders. They're still fundamentally a meritocracy. But you're saying the rest of it is fundamentally not.
I am. And that comes from, my experience and my interview with a lot of guys. Now, hey, these special operators, a lot of them tell me they're coming for us too. Like they don't want any aspects of the military not conforming to the social justice sort of woke aspect. But for now, those are the places where, because of the high intensity and the risk with which they undertake, the missions they undertake, they strip a lot of the nonsense out. And so that was kind of my compromise, where you say, hey, yes, I want you to join, but if you do it, go all the way, because I want you where I know you'll be surrounded by people who are there for the right reasons and because of the right reasons, and not because of political prerogatives, for the most part. But yeah, it's because conventional units, that's where it's easier to push this stuff. And that's where they've started.
If you like what you heard,
and even if you don't,
won't you please,
pretty please subscribe. Well, I hate to beg and I hate to plead, but please, pretty freaking please, please.